At Fort Henderson Military Base, a seemingly unremarkable civilian contractor was about to make a choice that would shatter 15 years of carefully constructed lies. What started as a routine memorial ceremony took a shocking turn when she refused to salute during the playing of taps. Rebecca Morgan wasn't your typical defense contractor. For 15 years, she had spent her life hiding in plain sight, known for her unsettling competence and mysterious past that no background check could penetrate. When she remained motionless while hundreds of military personnel rendered honors to fallen heroes, she had no idea she was walking into a reckoning that would expose government betrayals reaching the highest levels. Rebecca's silent act of defiance would lead to revelations that would force the military to confront its darkest secrets. What began as a simple refusal to follow protocol would become a moment of truth that transformed an entire institution. Fort Henderson would never be the same after the woman presumed dead for 15 years finally found her voice. The phoenix had risen from the ashes, and Rachel Stevens was ready to honor her fallen team, no matter the cost. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Fort Henderson like a secret, and Rebecca Morgan stepped through the main gate exactly 15 minutes before her required arrival time. At 43, she possessed the kind of face that disappeared in crowds, blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, clothes chosen for function rather than fashion, and an expression that revealed nothing about the thoughts churning beneath the surface. "Another civilian contractor," muttered Sergeant Davis to his partner as they checked her identification. "These corporate types think they can waltz in here and tell us how to do our jobs." Rebecca said nothing, accepting her temporary badge with a polite nod. The plastic rectangle felt foreign against her chest, a stark reminder of how far she'd fallen from the days when her credentials opened doors that most people didn't even know existed. Now she was just another face in the crowd, another civilian navigating the Byzantine world of military protocol. The Civilian Contractor Orientation Program at Fort Henderson was designed to familiarize non-military personnel with base protocols, a 3-week course that most participants found either fascinating or intimidating. Rebecca appeared to find it neither, maintaining the same calm demeanor whether discussing weapons safety or mess hall procedures. The orientation group consisted of 12 contractors representing various defense companies and consulting firms. Janet Collins, a logistics coordinator from Meridian Defense Solutions, immediately established herself as the group's social butterfly, her nervous energy manifesting in constant chatter about everything from the base's impressive history to the quality of the commissary coffee. Mark Thompson, a former Navy veteran turned private security consultant, observed the proceedings with the measured assessment of someone who'd spent 20 years learning to read people and situations. "First time on a military installation?" Janet asked Rebecca during the initial briefing, her voice carrying the forced cheerfulness of someone desperate to fill uncomfortable silences. "Something like that," Rebecca replied, her tone polite but distant. She positioned herself near the back of the orientation classroom, close enough to hear every word but far enough from the instructor to avoid unwanted attention. Her choice of seating revealed a tactical mindset that Mark's trained eye immediately recognized: back to the wall, clear sightlines to all exits, positioned to observe rather than be observed. Her apartment just outside the base perimeter reflected the same practical minimalism as her appearance. Bare walls, functional furniture, nothing that suggested personal attachments or sentimental value. The older sedan she drove told its own story. Someone who chose reliability over status, maintenance over appearance. No military memorabilia decorated her space. No photographs of family in uniform. Nothing that connected her to the world she was preparing to enter as a contractor. During the first week of orientation, subtle details began accumulating that didn't quite fit the simple picture she presented. Her posture remained perfectly straight without conscious effort, the kind of bearing that came from years of disciplined training rather than good intentions. She demonstrated an almost supernatural awareness of her surroundings, always knowing which exits were available and positioning herself strategically within any room. Colonel James Webb, the base's deputy commander for civilian affairs, made his first appearance during the Wednesday morning briefing. At 58, Webb carried himself with the rigid bearing of a career officer who'd never quite achieved the recognition he believed he deserved. His eyes swept the room with the calculating assessment of a predator identifying potential threats and weaknesses. "Ladies and gentlemen," Webb announced, his voice carrying the clipped authority of someone accustomed to unquestioned obedience. Fort Henderson has maintained its reputation as one of America's premier military installations through adherence to tradition, discipline, and respect for the chain of command. You are guests here, and you will conduct yourselves accordingly. Rebecca listened without visible reaction, but Mark noticed the slight tightening around her eyes, the kind of micro-expression that suggested familiarity with authoritarian posturing. Webb's gaze lingered on her longer than the others, as if something about her stillness irritated him in ways he couldn't articulate. "Did you see how she handled that rifle?" whispered Janet to Mark during the afternoon weapons familiarization exercise. "Like she'd been doing it her whole life." The observation was accurate. While other contractors fumbled with basic weapon safety procedures, Rebecca's movements flowed with practiced efficiency that suggested far more experience than any civilian contractor should possess. She field-stripped and reassembled an M4 carbine with muscle memory that spoke of countless hours of training, her fingers finding components without conscious thought. "Impressive work, Ms. Morgan," commented Sergeant Martinez, the range instructor. "Prior military experience?" "No," Rebecca replied simply, returning the weapon to its case with the same casual efficiency she demonstrated throughout the exercise. Mark's eyes narrowed slightly. 20 years in the service had taught him to recognize when someone was hiding something significant. The way she'd handled the weapon wasn't just competent. It was professional-grade muscle memory that couldn't be faked or quickly learned. Fellow participants began noticing the way she instinctively reacted to sudden sounds or movements, responses that spoke of combat readiness rather than office work. When a truck backfired in the parking lot during lunch break, Rebecca's hand moved toward her hip in a gesture that would have made perfect sense if she'd been carrying a sidearm. The motion lasted less than a second, but Mark caught it. The scars on her hands became visible during registration paperwork, thin white lines too precise and deliberate to be accidents from normal life experiences. They spoke of knife work, close-quarters combat, and situations where survival depended on split-second decisions made with lethal consequences. Her knowledge of military protocols extended far beyond what the orientation materials covered, answering questions about procedures that hadn't been taught yet. When Janet asked about proper protocol for handling classified documents during a theoretical scenario, Rebecca provided detailed procedures that wouldn't be covered until the following week. "How did you know about the ammunition storage regulations?" Mark asked during a coffee break, his tone casual but his eyes sharp with professional curiosity. "That wasn't in any of our reading materials." Rebecca's response was characteristically brief, lucky guess. But Mark's instincts told him otherwise. Her answer was too quick, too practiced. The kind of deflection that came from years of maintaining cover stories under pressure. Background checks revealed a puzzling 15-year gap in her employment history, a void that raised more questions than answers for anyone who took the time to look closely. According to her official records, Rebecca Morgan had worked various administrative positions until 2009, then simply disappeared from the employment rolls until resurfacing as a defense contractor 6 months ago. What none of them could see were the flashback glimpses that haunted her quiet moments, fragments of classified missions conducted in hostile territory, operations so sensitive that their very existence remained buried in government files. She carried the weight of betrayal by the command structure that once claimed to support her, decisions made by politicians and generals who never faced the consequences of their choices. Her entire unit had disappeared during one final mission, lost not to enemy action but to the machinations of those who valued political expediency over human lives. Rather than accept medals built on lies and cover-ups, she had chosen to vanish from official records, becoming a ghost in the system that once defined her identity. The memories of fallen comrades haunted her daily existence, their voices calling out from graves that bore no names and received no honor. She remembered each face, each voice, each moment of laughter shared in impossible circumstances, carrying their stories like sacred relics that must never be forgotten. As Rebecca sat alone in the mess hall during lunch break, watching other contractors form social groups and share stories about their backgrounds, she felt the familiar weight of survivors' guilt pressing down on her shoulders. The burden grew heavier, rather than lighter, with the passage of time, a constant reminder of the price paid for truth in a world that preferred comfortable lies. Little did she know that across the room General Harrison sat in civilian clothes, studying her with growing recognition. The years had changed her. The confident bearing remained, but something fundamental had shifted in the way she carried herself. Where once there had been the easy authority of someone born to command, now there was the careful stillness of someone who'd learned to hide in plain sight. The second week of orientation brought more intensive practical exercises, and with them, Rebecca's carefully constructed facade began showing hairline cracks that only the most observant noticed. Colonel Webb had made it his personal mission to monitor the civilian contractors with the dedication of a zealot, convinced that their presence somehow diminished the sanctity of his beloved Fort Henderson. During Tuesday morning's tactical planning module, the contractors were divided into teams and presented with a complex scenario, coordinating the evacuation of civilian personnel from a contested urban environment while maintaining security protocols. Most teams struggled with the basic logistics, their civilian mindsets unprepared for the brutal calculations required when human lives hung in the balance. Rebecca's team approached the problem differently. While others debated theoretical possibilities, she quietly took control, sketching out a plan that demonstrated an intimate understanding of tactical realities that no amount of orientation could provide. "We establish a secure perimeter here," she explained to her teammates, her finger tracing lines on the map with military precision. "Extract VIPs first through this corridor, then civilians in order of vulnerability. We'll need overwatch positions here and here to cover the withdrawal routes." Her plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its competence. She'd accounted for variables that the other teams hadn't even considered: communication protocols under fire, ammunition resupply points, casualty evacuation routes, and contingency plans for when everything went wrong. "How do you know all this?" asked David Chen, a software engineer from Lockheed Martin who'd been assigned to her team. "Common sense," Rebecca replied, but her explanation of urban warfare tactics that followed suggested knowledge that went far beyond common sense into the realm of hard-earned experience. Mark Thompson watched from across the room, his suspicions crystallizing into something approaching certainty. Her tactical recommendations weren't theoretical. They were practical applications of lessons learned in places where mistakes meant death. She spoke with the voice of someone who'd seen those plans executed under fire, who'd watched them succeed and fail in equal measure. Colonel Webb's irritation grew more pronounced as the week progressed. Rebecca's calm competence seemed to offend him on a personal level, as if her very presence challenged his authority in ways he couldn't articulate. During Thursday's logistics briefing, he interrupted her explanation of supply chain vulnerabilities with barely concealed hostility. "Ms. Morgan, while your insights are interesting, perhaps we should focus on practical applications rather than theoretical scenarios that exceed your level of clearance." The rebuke was petty and unprofessional, designed to embarrass her in front of the group. Rebecca absorbed it without visible reaction, but Mark noticed the way her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the kind of self-control that came from years of enduring far worse provocations from people with far more legitimate authority. Webb began assigning her increasingly menial tasks under the guise of additional learning opportunities. While other contractors participated in briefings on advanced security protocols, Rebecca found herself organizing supply inventories and updating personnel databases. The colonel's passive-aggressive campaign was transparent to everyone except himself. "This is ridiculous," Janet whispered to Mark during one particularly obvious display of Webb's pettiness. "She's obviously overqualified for this program. Why is he treating her like that?" Mark had his theories, but he kept them to himself. In his experience, bullies like Webb invariably targeted those they perceived as threats to their authority. What worried him was that Webb's instincts might be more accurate than his methods were appropriate. General Harrison spent increasingly more time observing the contractor orientation sessions, ostensibly reviewing the program's effectiveness, but actually studying Rebecca with growing intensity. Something about her bearing, the way she moved through space with unconscious tactical awareness, triggered memories that he'd tried to bury for 15 years. During Friday's field exercise, those memories crystallized into something approaching recognition. The contractors were conducting a simulated patrol through the base's training area when unexpected contact required immediate tactical response. While others froze or reacted with civilian panic, Rebecca dropped into a defensive position with fluid grace, her body moving through combat stances that had been drilled into muscle memory through years of repetition. For a split second, Harrison saw past the civilian clothes and careful camouflage to glimpse the operator she'd once been. The recognition hit him like a physical blow, dragging up memories of classified briefings and black operations that officially never existed. Rachel Stevens, codename Phoenix. One of the most effective intelligence operatives the CIA had ever produced, presumed killed in action during Operation Silent Thunder 15 years ago. The woman whose death he'd helped cover up for reasons that seemed pragmatic at the time but had haunted him ever since. Harrison excused himself from the observation post and retreated to his office, where he pulled up classified files that required his general's clearance to access. The official record was sparse. Rachel Stevens, age 28, killed during a classified operation in Afghanistan, body never recovered, posthumous decoration classified indefinitely. But Harrison remembered the truth behind those sanitized reports. He remembered the political pressures that had forced them to abandon Phoenix and her team when their mission became inconvenient. He remembered the heated arguments in secure conference rooms where careers were valued above lives, where the decision was made to write off 6 American operatives rather than risk political embarrassment. Most of all, he remembered the weight of that decision and the way it had eaten at his conscience every day since. Phoenix had been more than just another operator. She'd been the kind of soldier who believed in the mission even when the mission stopped believing in her. If Rebecca Morgan was indeed Rachel Stevens, then her presence at Fort Henderson represented more than just an operational security concern. It was a ghost returning to haunt the living, a reminder of choices made and prices paid in the shadowy world where patriotism and pragmatism intersected with often tragic results. Harrison found himself torn between professional duty and personal guilt. Protocol demanded that he report his suspicions immediately, initiating a security investigation that would inevitably expose Rachel's carefully constructed new identity. But something deeper, perhaps conscience, perhaps simple human decency, made him hesitate. She'd earned the right to disappear if that's what she chose. After what the system had done to her team, after the betrayals and cover-ups that had followed, perhaps the least they owed her was the privacy to rebuild her life on her own terms. Meanwhile, Rebecca continued navigating the increasingly hostile environment that Webb was creating around her. His petty harassment had escalated to open hostility, but she endured each indignity with the same stoic patience that had once seen her through interrogations in enemy territory. The other contractors began avoiding her, uncomfortable with the obvious tension between Rebecca and their military hosts. Only Mark maintained any semblance of friendly interaction, though even he was careful to keep their conversations brief and public. Rebecca understood their caution. In environments like Fort Henderson, association with someone who'd drawn official displeasure could be professionally hazardous. She didn't blame them for their self-preservation instincts. She'd made similar calculations herself in places where survival depended on reading the political currents correctly. What bothered her more was the way Webb's behavior reminded her of the institutional rot that had ultimately destroyed her faith in the system she'd once served. The casual abuse of authority, the protection of incompetent leadership at the expense of capable subordinates, the prioritization of appearance over substance, it was the same cancer that had metastasized throughout the intelligence community, leading inevitably to the betrayals that had cost her everything. As the second week drew to a close, Rebecca found herself standing at a crossroads she'd hoped never to face again. She could continue enduring Webb's harassment, complete the orientation program, and disappear back into the anonymous world of civilian life. Or she could stand up for herself, risking exposure but potentially preventing Webb from victimizing others with impunity. The choice would have been easier if she were the only one at risk. But she'd watched Webb's behavior toward other contractors, the way he targeted anyone who showed independence or competence beyond his narrow definitions. His actions represented the same institutional failures that had cost her team their lives, and she was no longer certain she could watch it happen again in silence. The third week of orientation began with Colonel Webb's announcement that additional practical assessments would be required for all contractors before program completion. His eyes lingered on Rebecca as he delivered this news, making it clear that the assessments were primarily directed at one particular participant. "Ms. Morgan," Webb called out after dismissing the other contractors, "I need you to remain behind for special assignment." Rebecca waited as the room emptied, her expression neutral, despite the familiar knot of tension forming in her stomach. She'd experienced this kind of targeted harassment before, usually from insecure leaders who mistook competence for insubordination. The equipment storage area requires complete inventory and reorganization, Webb informed her, his tone suggesting that this mundane task was somehow both urgent and complex. You'll find the necessary forms in the supply office. I expect completion by Friday. The assignment was clearly punitive, a week's worth of menial labor that served no practical purpose beyond asserting Webb's authority. Rebecca accepted the task without comment, understanding that any protest would only escalate the situation. The equipment storage facility was a maze of shelving units filled with everything from communications gear to field rations, most of it properly organized and requiring no inventory beyond what had been completed the previous month. Rebecca methodically worked through the meaningless task, using the solitude to process the increasingly familiar environment of Fort Henderson. Lieutenant Amanda Stevens, a young logistics officer who'd been quietly observing Webb's behavior, found Rebecca in the storage facility during the second day of her assignment. Stevens had graduated from West Point 2 years earlier, with idealistic notions about military service that were gradually being eroded by officers like Webb. "This is completely inappropriate," Stevens said without preamble, her voice carrying the outrage of someone still naive enough to believe the system would correct itself. "You're obviously overqualified for basic contractor orientation, and Colonel Webb is treating you like a punishment detail." Rebecca looked up from her clipboard, studying the young officer with interest. Stevens represented everything Rebecca had once been: committed, idealistic, convinced that integrity and competence would eventually triumph over politics and pettiness. "It's not worth worrying about," Rebecca replied carefully. "I'll complete the assignment and finish the program." "That's not the point," Stevens insisted. "His behavior is unprofessional and potentially discriminatory. I've been documenting these incidents for my own report." The revelation that someone was officially recording Webb's actions created both opportunity and danger. Documentation could provide protection, but it could also draw unwanted attention to Rebecca's presence at Fort Henderson. Meanwhile, Webb's campaign of harassment expanded beyond simple work assignments. During group meals, he made pointed comments about civilian contractors who overestimated their capabilities and, quote, failed to understand their place in the military hierarchy. His subordinates, reading the political winds correctly, began treating Rebecca with the same dismissive contempt their colonel demonstrated. Janet Collins, who'd initially been friendly, now avoided Rebecca entirely, her career instincts overriding any personal loyalty. Mark Thompson remained superficially cordial, but carefully neutral, unwilling to risk his professional standing for someone he barely knew. Smart politics, Rebecca thought, watching the careful social maneuvering around her pariah status. She understood their calculations and bore them no ill will. In environments where careers could be destroyed by association with the wrong people, self-preservation was a rational response. Webb escalated his tactics during Wednesday's briefing on base security protocols. When Rebecca asked a legitimate question about emergency procedures, he cut her off with barely concealed hostility. "Ms. Morgan, perhaps you should focus on understanding basic procedures before attempting to critique established protocols," he snapped, his voice carrying clearly to every person in the room. The public humiliation was calculated and cruel, designed to isolate her completely from the group dynamic. Rebecca absorbed it without visible reaction, but Mark noticed the way her hands remained perfectly still despite what must have been significant emotional pressure. That evening, Rebecca walked alone through the older sections of Fort Henderson, areas that housed facilities dating back to the base's establishment during World War II. These buildings carried the weight of history, having housed generations of soldiers who'd served and died in conflicts spanning the globe. She found herself standing before a small memorial garden dedicated to personnel who died in classified operations, their names absent from the stone markers that bore only dates and generic references to service members who made the ultimate sacrifice. The anonymity of their recognition felt familiar. These were her people, the ones who died in shadows and been buried in silence. For the first time since arriving at Fort Henderson, Rebecca allowed herself to truly remember, not just the betrayal and loss that had defined her exile, but the camaraderie and purpose that had made the sacrifices meaningful. Her team had been more than professional colleagues. They'd been family-bound by shared danger and common purpose. James Bear Morrison, the team's demolitions expert, who could disarm any explosive device ever created but couldn't figure out how to operate his own smartphone. Sarah Chen, their communications specialist, whose dry humor had sustained morale through the darkest missions. Miguel Santos, their medic who'd saved more lives than any doctor but never received recognition because their operations officially didn't exist. Their ghosts walked with her through the memorial garden, reminding her of why she'd chosen exile over acceptance of medals built on lies. They deserved better than to be written off as acceptable losses in someone else's political calculation. Lieutenant Stevens found her there an hour later, standing motionless before the memorial stones. "I've filed my report about Colonel Webb's behavior," Stevens said quietly. "Whatever his personal issues with you, he's violating several regulations regarding treatment of civilian personnel." Rebecca turned to face the young officer, seeing in her the kind of moral courage that the system desperately needed but rarely rewarded. "Be careful," she warned. "Men like Webb have ways of punishing subordinates who challenge their authority. Your career could suffer for doing the right thing." Stevens straightened to attention, her jaw set with determination that reminded Rebecca painfully of her younger self. "Then that's a price worth paying," Stevens replied. "If we don't hold ourselves accountable, we have no right to demand accountability from others." The words struck Rebecca like a physical blow, carrying echoes of conversations she'd had with her team members years earlier. They'd all believed in accountability once, before learning that institutional protection rarely extended to those who inconvenienced their superiors. Friday's final assignment pushed Webb's harassment into clearly abusive territory. He assigned Rebecca to clean and inspect equipment that had already been properly maintained, requiring her to complete detailed paperwork justifying work that served no practical purpose. "Perhaps next time you'll approach your assignments with appropriate humility," Webb commented as he reviewed her completed documentation, his tone making it clear that he viewed her competence as a personal affront. Rebecca submitted to his petty tyranny without protest, understanding that any resistance would only provide him with justification for escalating his campaign. But something fundamental had shifted during her week of isolation and abuse. The same institutional failures that had cost her team their lives were playing out again in microcosm, with Webb as the petty dictator and herself as the convenient target. She'd spent 15 years running from the system that had betrayed her, building a new identity based on anonymity and careful distance from anything that might trigger recognition. But Fort Henderson was forcing her to confront the reality that escape was ultimately impossible. The same corruption that had destroyed her faith in service was alive and thriving, victimizing new generations of idealistic soldiers like Lieutenant Stevens. As she completed her final orientation requirements, Rebecca found herself facing a choice that would determine not just her immediate future, but the meaning of everything she'd endured since Operation Silent Thunder. She could continue hiding, protecting her carefully constructed anonymity, while allowing Webb's abuse to continue unchecked. Or she could stand up, risking exposure but potentially preventing other victims from suffering the same institutional failures that had once cost her everything. The Memorial Garden's anonymous stones seemed to whisper encouragement as she wrestled with the decision. Her fallen teammates had never gotten the chance to hold their betrayers accountable, but perhaps she could honor their memory by ensuring that their deaths hadn't been entirely meaningless. The graduation ceremony was scheduled for the following week, a formal event where contractors would receive their base access credentials and begin their assigned duties. It would be Rebecca's final opportunity to complete the program anonymously and disappear back into civilian life. But it would also be her first opportunity in 15 years to stop running from the truth. Monday morning brought the capstone exercise that would conclude the civilian contractor orientation program, a complex tactical simulation designed to test everything the participants had learned about base security protocols, emergency procedures, and crisis management. Colonel Webb had structured the exercise as a hostage rescue scenario, confident that it would expose the limitations of civilian thinking when confronted with military realities. The simulation took place in Fort Henderson's Urban Warfare Training Facility, a collection of buildings designed to replicate the challenges of operating in contested urban environments. The contractors were divided into 3 teams, each assigned a different aspect of the operation: perimeter security, hostage extraction, and command coordination. Webb deliberately assigned Rebecca to the extraction team, anticipating that she would struggle with the complex tactical requirements and provide him with justification for a poor evaluation. What he didn't anticipate was that he'd just handed operational control to someone who'd successfully executed similar missions in environments where failure meant death rather than embarrassment. Rebecca studied the tactical situation with the methodical precision of a professional operator, her mind automatically cataloging variables that the other participants hadn't even considered. The simulated hostage location occupied the second floor of a three-story building with multiple access points, windows that could serve as either escape routes or sniper positions, and civilian personnel scattered throughout the area who could become casualties if the operation went wrong. "We need to establish containment first," Rebecca explained to her team, her voice carrying a quiet authority that made even the most skeptical participants pay attention. "Janet, I need you coordinating with the perimeter team to ensure we have eyes on all possible exit routes. David, you're handling communications between our team and command. Mark, you're with me on the actual extraction." Her plan unfolded with surgical precision. Rather than the frontal assault that most teams would attempt, Rebecca designed a multi-axis approach that would minimize casualties while maximizing tactical advantage. She identified the optimal breach points, calculated the timing required for coordinated movement, and established contingency plans for when the primary operation encountered unexpected resistance. "How do you account for the civilians on the first floor?" asked David, referring to the role players who represented innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "We clear them first through the rear emergency exit," Rebecca replied, sketching quick diagrams that demonstrated her understanding of room-clearing procedures. "Creates confusion that masks our primary approach, reduces potential casualties, and eliminates variables that could compromise the extraction." Webb watched from the command center with growing unease as Rebecca's team executed their plan with professional competence that exceeded anything he'd witnessed from civilian contractors. Her tactical recommendations weren't theoretical. They were practical applications of hard-won experience, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd seen these procedures succeed under fire. The simulation commenced at precisely 09:00 hours. While the other team struggled with basic coordination and communication protocols, Rebecca's group moved through their assigned tasks with fluid efficiency that spoke of actual training rather than classroom theory. She led from the front, demonstrating room-clearing techniques that showed intimate familiarity with urban warfare tactics. "Contact left, second floor window," called Mark, identifying a simulated enemy position that the exercise controllers had positioned to test the team's situational awareness. Rebecca's response was immediate and tactically sound. "Suppressing fire from the courtyard position, David. Janet, I need smoke coverage for the rear approach. Mark, you're with me on the breach." Her movements during the simulated assault revealed training that went far beyond what any civilian contractor should possess. She moved through the building with tactical awareness that suggested years of experience in hostile environments, her body positioning and weapon handling demonstrating muscle memory that couldn't be faked or quickly learned. The hostage extraction itself was executed with textbook precision. Rebecca's team located the simulated hostages, secured the area, and coordinated evacuation procedures that minimized exposure to potential threats. Her leadership throughout the operation was calm, decisive, and utterly professional, the kind of performance that typically required years of military training to achieve. "Targets secured. All personnel accounted for," Rebecca reported to the command center, her voice steady despite the physical demands of the exercise. "Requesting medical evaluation for one simulated casualty and transport coordination for immediate evacuation." The entire operation had taken 17 minutes from initiation to completion, a time that impressed even the military observers who'd expected the civilian teams to struggle with basic procedures. Webb stared at the monitors displaying Rebecca's team's performance, his confusion and irritation growing with each perfectly executed tactical movement. Colonel Harrison observed the exercise from the visitors' gallery, his suspicions about Rebecca's identity crystallizing into near certainty as he watched her demonstrate capabilities that no civilian contractor should possess. Her tactical knowledge wasn't academic, it was operational, gained through experience in environments where mistakes had permanent consequences. When the simulation concluded, Webb confronted Rebecca with barely concealed hostility, his professional facade cracking under the pressure of witnessing competence he couldn't explain or control. "That was quite a performance, Ms. Morgan," he said, his tone making it clear that he viewed her success as somehow inappropriate. "Perhaps you'd care to explain where a civilian contractor acquired such extensive tactical knowledge." Rebecca met his gaze steadily, her expression revealing nothing about the calculations running through her mind. She'd known that exceptional performance would draw attention, but the alternative, deliberately failing to protect Webb's ego, would have dishonored the memory of teammates who died executing similar operations under far more dangerous conditions. "I've always been good at following instructions," she replied, her voice carrying just enough respectful deference to avoid open confrontation while making it clear that she wouldn't be intimidated. Webb's frustration was visible to everyone in the debriefing room. He'd structured the exercise to highlight civilian limitations, instead witnessing a level of professional competence that challenged his assumptions about military superiority over contractor capabilities. Mark Thompson approached Rebecca after the formal debriefing, his expression thoughtful and slightly concerned. 20 years of military service had taught him to recognize genuine expertise, and what he'd witnessed during the simulation went far beyond anything that could be learned through civilian training programs. "That was impressive work in there," he said carefully, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp with professional curiosity. "You moved like someone with extensive field experience." "I pay attention to details," Rebecca replied, deflecting his implied question with the same practiced ease she'd demonstrated throughout the orientation program. But Mark wasn't satisfied with evasive answers. He'd spent too many years working with special operations personnel to miss the signs of advanced training and operational experience. Rebecca's performance hadn't just been competent, it had been professional-grade expertise applied with the kind of tactical awareness that typically required years of development in high-stress environments. Lieutenant Stevens watched the exchange with growing awareness that Rebecca represented something far more complex than a simple civilian contractor. The tactical demonstration had revealed capabilities that suggested military training of the highest caliber, yet her background check showed no record of service in any branch of the armed forces. The contradiction was troubling for someone like Stevens, who'd built her career on the assumption that official records accurately reflected reality. If Rebecca possessed the kind of training she demonstrated, why wasn't it reflected in her personnel file? And more importantly, what circumstances would lead someone with such capabilities to hide their military background? That evening, Rebecca walked alone through Fort Henderson's training areas, her mind processing the day's events and their potential consequences. She'd known that the tactical exercise would test more than just her ability to follow procedures. It would reveal capabilities that could trigger recognition from anyone familiar with special operations training. The decision to perform at her actual capability level rather than maintaining her civilian facade had been deliberate. She'd watched too many people suffer under Webb's incompetent leadership to deliberately fail an exercise that could demonstrate proper tactical procedures to other participants who might face real-world situations requiring such knowledge. Her fallen teammates would have understood the choice. They'd all believed that competence carried moral obligations, that possessing capabilities created responsibilities that couldn't be abandoned for personal convenience. If her demonstration prevented even one future casualty by teaching proper procedures, it would honor their sacrifice more than continued anonymity. But she also understood the risks. Exceptional performance would inevitably draw scrutiny from people trained to recognize operational capabilities. The carefully constructed identity that had protected her for 15 years was beginning to show cracks that might soon become fractures. General Harrison spent that evening reviewing classified files in his secure office, cross-referencing Rebecca's demonstrated capabilities with historical records of special operations personnel. The tactical knowledge she displayed wasn't general military training. It was specific to certain types of classified operations conducted by highly specialized units. Her movement patterns, communication protocols, and decision-making processes all suggested training in disciplines that few people outside the intelligence community would recognize. But Harrison's background in overseeing special operations gave him the knowledge necessary to identify the specific skill sets she'd demonstrated. The more he researched, the more convinced he became that Rebecca Morgan was indeed Rachel Stevens, presumed dead for 15 years but apparently very much alive and hiding in plain sight at Fort Henderson. The question that haunted him was whether her presence represented an operational security threat or simply a ghost seeking peace from a past that had already extracted too high a price. Webb retreated to his office that evening, consumed by frustration and growing paranoia about Rebecca's true identity. Her performance during the tactical exercise had shattered his assumptions about civilian capabilities while revealing knowledge that no contractor should possess. The contradiction between her official background and demonstrated abilities suggested possibilities that threatened his sense of control over the orientation program. He began drafting requests for enhanced background investigations, determined to uncover whatever secrets Rebecca was hiding. If she was misrepresenting her qualifications or background, he would expose her deception and use it as justification for the harassment he'd inflicted throughout the program. What Webb didn't understand was that some secrets were protected by classifications far above his security clearance, and that his investigation would soon encounter walls designed to protect operations that officially never existed. Tuesday morning found Colonel Webb in his office at 0630 hours, fueled by coffee and righteous indignation as he initiated what he believed would be a routine background investigation into Rebecca Morgan's credentials and employment history. His frustration from the previous day's tactical exercise had crystallized into determination to expose whatever deception he was certain she was perpetrating. His first request for enhanced records review returned within an hour with a response that stopped him cold. Insufficient clearance level for requested information. Contact Deputy Director, Defense Intelligence Agency for authorization. Webb stared at his computer screen, his certainty wavering for the first time since Rebecca had arrived at Fort Henderson. Civilian contractors didn't typically require DIA clearance for background verification. The response suggested layers of classification that exceeded anything he'd encountered in his 26-year career. His second attempt, routed through different channels at Defense Security Service, produced an even more troubling result. Subject information requires SAP authorization. Direct all inquiries to SAP Security Officer, Pentagon, Room 2E924. SAP, Special Access Programs. The designation sent a chill through Webb's growing paranoia. Special Access Programs represented the highest levels of government classification. Operations so sensitive that their very existence was compartmentalized beyond normal security protocols. Whatever Rebecca Morgan was hiding, it was protected by security measures typically reserved for operations involving national security at the highest levels. Lieutenant Stevens received Webb's order to dig deeper into Rebecca's background with growing unease. Her documentation of his harassment had already been submitted through proper channels, and she understood that his escalating investigation might represent retaliation against someone who'd embarrassed him professionally. "Sir, perhaps I should clarify the specific nature of your concerns," Stevens suggested carefully. Ms. Morgan completed all orientation requirements satisfactorily, and her performance during yesterday's exercise was exemplary. Webb's response revealed the depth of his obsession with Rebecca's perceived deception. "Exemplary performance that exceeds her supposed qualifications, Lieutenant. I want to know how a civilian contractor acquired tactical knowledge that surpasses what most military personnel possess." Stevens found herself caught between professional duty and growing moral discomfort with Webb's behavior. His investigation was beginning to resemble a witch hunt driven more by personal animosity than legitimate security concerns. Meanwhile, General Harrison was conducting his own investigation through channels that Webb couldn't access. His security clearance opened doors that revealed fragments of the truth about Operation Silent Thunder and the 6 operatives who'd been written off as acceptable losses when their mission became politically inconvenient. The classified after-action report made for grim reading. Phoenix team had been deployed to eliminate a high-value target whose elimination would have prevented a terrorist attack, but potentially embarrassed allied governments who'd been secretly negotiating with the target's organization. When political considerations outweighed operational necessity, the team had been abandoned in hostile territory without extraction support. 5 members of Phoenix team had been confirmed killed in action. Rachel Stevens, codename Phoenix, had been listed as missing, presumed dead when her body was never recovered. The decision to close the case without exhaustive search efforts had been justified by the same political considerations that had led to the team's abandonment. Harrison remembered the heated arguments in secure conference rooms, the phone calls with politicians who valued diplomatic convenience over operator lives, and the sick feeling in his stomach when the final decision was made to classify the entire operation at levels that would prevent any future investigation or accountability. He'd been a colonel then, lacking the authority to prevent the betrayal but senior enough to understand its implications. The guilt had eaten at him for 15 years, a constant reminder that sometimes the system he'd sworn to serve valued expedience over honor. If Rebecca Morgan was indeed Rachel Stevens, then her survival represented both a miracle and a potential catastrophe. Miracle because she'd somehow escaped a situation that had killed her entire team. Catastrophe because her reappearance could expose cover-ups that reached the highest levels of government and implicated officials who were still serving in positions of authority. Harrison found himself facing the same moral crossroads that had defined his career 15 years earlier. He could report his suspicions, initiating investigations that would inevitably expose Rachel's carefully constructed new identity while potentially triggering a national security incident. Or he could remain silent, honoring the debt he owed to someone the system had already betrayed once. Rebecca spent Tuesday afternoon in the base library, researching current events and policy developments that might affect her future security. 15 years of careful anonymity had taught her to monitor the political landscape for changes that could threaten her continued invisibility. Her investigation into Fort Henderson's current leadership revealed connections that troubled her professional instincts. Several senior officers had been involved in Middle Eastern operations during the time frame of Operation Silent Thunder, creating the possibility that someone might recognize her despite the passage of years and her altered appearance. General Harrison's presence was particularly concerning. His position as deputy commander meant he would have access to classified briefings and historical operational records that could trigger recognition. If he'd been involved in oversight of special operations during her active duty period, he might possess the knowledge necessary to identify her despite her changed circumstances. The afternoon mail delivery brought Webb a response to his initial DIA inquiry that deepened his confusion while intensifying his paranoia. The letter, marked with security classifications he'd never seen before, informed him that any investigation into Rebecca Morgan's background required written authorization from the Secretary of Defense and notification of the Director of National Intelligence. The bureaucratic wall was unprecedented in Webb's experience. Even investigations involving suspected foreign intelligence operatives didn't typically require such high-level authorization. The response suggested that Rebecca's background touched on matters of such sensitivity that routine military channels were insufficient to handle inquiries. Webb's subordinates began avoiding him as his obsession with Rebecca consumed increasing amounts of his time and attention. His demands for impossible levels of background investigation created administrative burdens that interfered with normal base operations while revealing his growing detachment from rational command decisions. That evening, Rebecca made a pilgrimage to a location she'd avoided since arriving at Fort Henderson, a small, unmarked section of the base cemetery where several graves bore only numbers instead of names. These were the resting places of personnel who died in classified operations, their identities hidden even in death to protect ongoing operations and national security interests. She stood before one particular grave marked only with Unknown Service Member 2009, knowing that it had been prepared for her when she'd been presumed dead after Operation Silent Thunder. The headstone represented both the death of Rachel Stevens and the birth of Rebecca Morgan, a bureaucratic resurrection that had allowed her to escape the system that had betrayed her team. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was visiting her own grave while contemplating whether to reveal herself to honor her fallen teammates. They deserved better than anonymous markers in forgotten corners of military cemeteries, but exposing their sacrifice would require her to surrender the anonymity that had protected her for 15 years. Her meditation was interrupted by approaching footsteps. General Harrison emerged from the shadows between the headstones, his expression grave as he studied the woman he now knew was Rachel Stevens. "Visiting friends?" he asked quietly, his tone carrying none of the authority typical of general officers addressing subordinates. Rebecca turned to face him, reading recognition in his eyes despite his attempt to maintain professional neutrality. The moment she dreaded for 15 years had finally arrived. Discovery by someone with the knowledge and authority to end her carefully constructed anonymity. "Something like that," she replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "Sometimes it's important to remember the dead." Harrison stepped closer, his voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained private. Rachel Stevens was reported killed in action during Operation Silent Thunder. Her body was never recovered. The use of her real name hit Rebecca like a physical blow, dragging her back to memories she'd spent years trying to bury. For a moment, she considered maintaining her cover story, pretending confusion about his apparent mistake. But the weight of 15 years' worth of lies suddenly felt unbearable. "Rachel Stevens died in that operation," she replied carefully. "Rebecca Morgan is just trying to complete a contractor orientation program without causing trouble." Harrison nodded slowly, understanding the careful distinction she was making between past and present identities. The official record indicates that Phoenix team was lost due to enemy action. The families were told their loved ones died as heroes serving their country. Official records often contain convenient fictions, Rebecca said, her voice carrying years of accumulated bitterness. The truth tends to be more complicated and less comfortable for the people who make policy decisions. They stood in silence among the graves, two people bound by shared knowledge of operations that officially never existed, and betrayals that could never be publicly acknowledged. Harrison felt the weight of 15 years' worth of guilt pressing down on him, as he faced someone who'd paid the ultimate price for his failure to prevent a political decision that had cost 5 lives. "What do you want from me?" Rebecca asked finally, her tone suggesting that she was prepared for any response from exposure to elimination. Harrison considered his options carefully. He possessed the authority to end her exile with a single phone call, but he also understood that such action would likely destroy whatever peace she'd managed to find in her new identity. "I want to know how to make this right," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated guilt and genuine desire for redemption. "Your team deserved better than what happened to them. You deserved better." Rebecca studied his face in the gathering darkness, searching for signs of deception or manipulation. What she found instead was the genuine remorse of someone who'd spent 15 years carrying the burden of knowledge about operations that had gone wrong for all the wrong reasons. "Some things can't be made right," she said finally. "Some debts can't be repaid. Sometimes the best you can do is try not to make the same mistakes again." Harrison understood that she was offering him something more valuable than forgiveness, the opportunity to honor her sacrifice by ensuring it hadn't been meaningless. The question was whether he possessed the courage to take actions that might jeopardize his own career, while potentially providing justice for operations that had been buried beneath layers of classification and political convenience. Friday morning dawned clear and bright over Fort Henderson, the kind of perfect weather that military planners interpreted as divine approval for ceremonial events. The base memorial service was scheduled for 1,100 hours, a formal ceremony to honor fallen personnel that would conclude the civilian contractor orientation program and serve as their introduction to the military traditions they'd be supporting in their new roles. Colonel Webb had spent the previous 3 days in increasingly frantic attempts to penetrate the security walls surrounding Rebecca Morgan's background, each inquiry returning responses that deepened his paranoia while revealing nothing useful about her true identity. His obsession had begun affecting his professional performance, causing several senior officers to question his fitness for continued command. Lieutenant Stevens watched Webb's deteriorating mental state with growing concern and professional dismay. His investigation had evolved from legitimate security inquiry into what could only be described as harassment driven by personal vendetta rather than operational necessity. Rebecca dressed carefully for the ceremony, choosing her most conservative business attire in an attempt to blend seamlessly into the crowd of contractors, base personnel, and visiting dignitaries. She understood that the memorial service would be her final public appearance as Rebecca Morgan, before completing the orientation program and beginning her assigned duties in relative anonymity. The ceremony was held on Fort Henderson's main parade ground, a vast expanse of manicured grass surrounded by buildings that had witnessed decades of similar events. Bleachers had been erected for civilian guests, while military personnel stood in formation according to rank and unit affiliation. Admiral Robert Kellerman, Chief of Naval Operations, served as the event's keynote speaker. His presence elevated the ceremony beyond routine base activities into something approaching national significance, an honor that Webb had lobbied extensively to arrange as a demonstration of Fort Henderson's continued importance to military operations. Rebecca positioned herself in the back row of the contractor seating area, maintaining her pattern of observation from positions that offered multiple exit routes and clear sight lines to potential threats. Her tactical awareness remained heightened, despite the secure environment, muscle memory from years of operations where complacency could prove fatal. General Harrison sat with the senior officer contingent, his attention focused more on Rebecca than on the ceremonial proceedings. Their conversation in the cemetery had convinced him that she was indeed Rachel Stevens, but it had also revealed the depth of her transformation from elite operative to carefully constructed civilian identity. The ceremony began with traditional military honors, presentation of colors, playing of the national anthem, and formal remarks from base leadership about the importance of service and sacrifice. Webb delivered a brief speech about the partnership between military and civilian personnel that rang hollow to anyone familiar with his behavior toward the contractor participants. Admiral Kellerman's keynote address focused on the hidden sacrifices made by military personnel whose service couldn't be publicly acknowledged due to operational security requirements. His words carried particular resonance for Rebecca, who understood that he was speaking about operations like the one that had cost her team their lives. "We gather today to honor not only those whose names are inscribed on monuments," Kellerman said, his voice carrying across the parade ground with practiced authority, "but also those whose service remains classified, whose sacrifices are known only to God and country, whose families were told they died as heroes without ever learning the full truth of their heroism." Rebecca felt tears threatening for the first time since arriving at Fort Henderson. Kellerman's words seemed directed at her personally, acknowledging the reality that her teammates' sacrifice would never receive public recognition, while their families lived with convenient fictions about how they'd died. The ceremonial high point approached as the base honor guard prepared to present arms during the playing of taps and the traditional moment of silence for fallen personnel. All military personnel would render appropriate honors according to their service protocols, while civilians were expected to stand respectfully with hands over hearts. Webb had positioned himself to observe the contractor seating area, anticipating that the ceremony's emotional impact might reveal whatever deception he was certain Rebecca was maintaining. His eyes fixed on her with predatory intensity as the honor guard took their positions. The first notes of taps echoed across the parade ground, that haunting melody that had accompanied military funerals since the Civil War. Every military person present snapped to attention and rendered the salute appropriate to their service, a synchronized display of respect that spoke to decades of training and tradition. Rebecca remained standing but did not salute, her hands remaining at her sides as she listened to the familiar melody that had played at too many funerals for friends whose names would never appear on any public memorial. The decision was conscious and deliberate. She would honor her fallen teammates in her own way rather than participating in ceremonies that excluded their sacrifice. Webb's reaction was immediate and visceral. The sight of Rebecca refusing to render honors during the playing of taps confirmed his suspicions that she was hiding something significant about her background. Her failure to salute represented not just disrespect, but potential evidence of deception about military service. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as other attendees noticed Rebecca's motionless stance amid the sea of saluting personnel. The breach of protocol was subtle but unmistakable to anyone familiar with military ceremonies, creating confusion among those who couldn't understand why a civilian contractor would deliberately refuse to show respect during such a solemn moment. Mark Thompson, standing in formation with other Navy veterans, spotted Rebecca's stillness and felt his suspicions crystallize into certainty. Her refusal to salute wasn't ignorance or disrespect. It was a deliberate statement by someone who had every right to render military honors, but chose not to participate in ceremonies that failed to acknowledge the complete truth about military sacrifice. Admiral Kellerman, observing from the platform, noticed the disturbance in the contractor seating area and followed the direction of various stairs to identify Rebecca as the source of the disruption. Something about her bearing, even in stillness, triggered memories that he couldn't immediately place but felt compelling enough to warrant further investigation. As taps concluded and the honor guard lowered their weapons, a profound silence settled over the parade ground. The moment stretched uncomfortably as hundreds of people processed what they'd witnessed: a civilian contractor's apparent refusal to show respect during one of the military's most sacred traditions. Webb's face flushed with barely controlled rage as he watched Rebecca maintain her composed stillness without any apparent awareness that her behavior had created a significant disruption. Her calm indifference to the controversy she'd created only intensified his conviction that she was deliberately mocking military traditions. The ceremony concluded with closing remarks and dismissal of formation, but the damage to Webb's carefully orchestrated event was already complete. Instead of celebrating successful partnership between military and civilian personnel, attendees were discussing the contractor who'd refused to show proper respect during the memorial service. Rebecca walked calmly toward the parking area, understanding that her symbolic protest had irrevocably altered her status at Fort Henderson while achieving something she'd needed for 15 years: a public statement about the incomplete nature of military honors that excluded classified operations and hidden sacrifices. Lieutenant Stevens caught up with her before she reached her vehicle, her expression troubled by the implications of what she'd witnessed. "Ms. Morgan, I need to ask about what happened during the ceremony," Stevens said carefully. "Your failure to salute during taps has created significant concern among the base leadership." Rebecca met her gaze steadily, recognizing in the young officer someone who genuinely cared about military traditions and wanted to understand rather than simply condemn. "Sometimes the most respectful thing you can do is refuse to participate in incomplete ceremonies," Rebecca replied. "Honoring some sacrifices while ignoring others isn't really honor at all." Her response only deepened Stevens' confusion while providing no explanation for behavior that violated every protocol she'd been taught about civilian conduct during military ceremonies. But something in Rebecca's tone suggested depths of knowledge and experience that exceeded anything a simple contractor should possess. Admiral Kellerman watched Rebecca's departure from his position on the reviewing platform, his memory finally placing the familiar elements he'd recognized in her bearing and appearance. The realization hit him like a physical blow as 15 years of buried guilt and institutional complicity came flooding back with devastating clarity. Rachel Stevens, Phoenix, the operative whose death he'd helped cover up for reasons that had seemed pragmatic at the time, but had haunted him ever since. She was alive, somehow survived the operation that had killed her entire team, and had just delivered a public condemnation of the system that had abandoned them. The aftermath of Friday's memorial service created a crisis atmosphere throughout Fort Henderson's command structure that extended far beyond the simple breach of protocol that civilian observers had witnessed. Colonel Webb's furious demands for immediate disciplinary action against Rebecca Morgan met with increasingly complex resistance from senior officers who recognized implications that extended beyond base-level authority. Admiral Kellerman spent Friday evening in secure communications with Pentagon officials, verifying suspicions that had crystallized during Rebecca's silent protest. The classified databases he accessed confirmed what his memory had already suggested. Rachel Stevens, codename Phoenix, had been declared killed in action during Operation Silent Thunder, but her body had never been recovered, and certain aspects of her file remained under restrictions that required his level of clearance to access. By Saturday morning, the simple question of how to handle a contractor's disrespectful behavior had evolved into a national security issue requiring coordination between multiple intelligence agencies and careful consideration of classified operations that officially never existed. Webb found himself excluded from high-level discussions about Rebecca's fate, his security clearance insufficient for the conversations taking place in secure conference rooms throughout the Pentagon. His frustrated attempts to assert local command authority were politely but firmly overruled by officials whose authority exceeded his by several levels. General Harrison received orders Saturday afternoon to coordinate with Admiral Kellerman on, quote, damage assessment and containment protocols related to recent security developments at Fort Henderson. The bureaucratic language concealed a simple reality. Rachel Stevens had revealed herself through her protest, and the government needed to decide how to handle someone whose continued existence could expose cover-ups that reached the highest levels of national security establishment. Rebecca spent Saturday in her apartment, understanding that her symbolic protest had set in motion events beyond her control while achieving something she'd needed for 15 years, a public statement about the incomplete nature of official recognition for military sacrifice. She'd honored her fallen teammates in the only way available to someone who officially didn't exist, refusing to participate in ceremonies that excluded their sacrifice. Her phone remained silent, but she knew that powerful people were making decisions about her future based on calculations that prioritized institutional protection over individual rights. The same dynamics that had led to Operation Silent Thunder's betrayal were playing out again, with her existence representing a potential threat to officials who'd built careers on successful cover-ups. Sunday morning brought unexpected visitors to Rebecca's apartment. Admiral Kellerman arrived accompanied by General Harrison and a security detail that spoke to the seriousness of the situation, while suggesting that the visit represented official business rather than social courtesy. "Miss Morgan," Kellerman said formally, "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about current events and historical operations that may be relevant to your status here at Fort Henderson." Rebecca invited them inside, understanding that the moment of final revelation had arrived. 15 years of careful anonymity were ending, but she felt more relief than fear at the prospect of abandoning a deception that had become increasingly difficult to maintain. "Admiral," she replied, her voice carrying the respect due his rank while maintaining the careful neutrality she'd practiced for years. "I assume this visit relates to Friday's memorial service and certain reactions to behavior that some found inappropriate." Kellerman studied her carefully, searching for signs of the elite operative she'd once been beneath the carefully constructed civilian facade she'd maintained for so long. "Agent Stevens," he said quietly, using her real name for the first time in 15 years, We need to discuss Operation Silent Thunder and certain decisions that were made following your team's final mission. The use of her real name and operational designation felt like removing armor that had protected her from a hostile world, but had also isolated her from any possibility of genuine connection or recognition. For the first time since escaping from Afghanistan, Rachel allowed her true identity to surface completely. Phoenix Team was betrayed by the same people who sent us into that operation, she said, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of finally speaking truth that had been buried for 15 years. My teammates died because political considerations outweighed operational necessity. I survived because I was lucky enough to be unconscious when the extraction that never came failed to arrive. Harrison felt 15 years of accumulated guilt pressing down on him as he faced someone who'd paid the ultimate price for decisions made in secure conference rooms by people who never faced the consequences of their choices. The official record indicates that Phoenix Team was lost due to enemy action, he said carefully. The families were told their loved ones died as heroes serving their country. The official record contains convenient fictions designed to protect people who valued diplomatic convenience over operator lives, Rachel replied. My teammates died as heroes, but they were murdered by the same government they'd sworn to serve. Kellerman understood that they'd reached the moment of final reckoning, when 15 years of cover-ups and institutional betrayal would either be acknowledged or perpetuated through additional layers of deception and control. What do you want, Agent Stevens? He asked. What would constitute justice for Phoenix Team and compensation for what you've endured since Operation Silent Thunder? Rachel considered the question carefully, understanding that her answer would determine not only her immediate future but potentially expose cover-ups that could topple governments and destroy careers built on successful concealment of institutional failures. I want the truth, she said finally, not recognition or compensation or revenge. Just acknowledgement that Phoenix Team died serving their country, and that their sacrifice deserves better than burial beneath layers of classification and political convenience. The simple request represented a potentially catastrophic threat to officials whose careers depended on maintaining cover-ups that had successfully concealed government betrayal of its own operatives. But it also offered the possibility of finally providing justice for operations that had gone wrong for all the wrong reasons. Kellerman made a decision that would define his legacy as much as any operational command he'd exercised during his distinguished career. Agent Stevens, he said formally, by the authority vested in me as Chief of Naval Operations and with full knowledge of the classified nature of Operation Silent Thunder, I hereby acknowledge the heroic service of Phoenix Team and express the gratitude of a nation that can never publicly recognize their sacrifice. The words weren't official policy or government acknowledgement, but they represented something more valuable, recognition from someone with the authority and knowledge to understand the true nature of Phoenix Team's service and sacrifice. Furthermore, Kellerman continued, I'm prepared to offer you a unique position within the military education system, teaching advanced tactical procedures and ethical decision-making to the next generation of officers, with complete autonomy regarding curriculum and approach. The offer represented more than employment. It was an opportunity to ensure that Phoenix Team's sacrifice would have meaning by teaching future officers about the moral complexities of military service and the importance of maintaining integrity, even when institutional pressures encouraged expedient compromises. Rachel felt tears flowing freely for the first time since escaping from Afghanistan, not from grief, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being seen and acknowledged for who she truly was and what she'd endured. I accept, she said simply, understanding that her exile was ending not with return to her previous identity, but with transformation into something new, a bridge between the world of classified operations and the need for ethical military leadership. Admiral Kellerman nodded formally, then broke protocol by extending his hand in a gesture of respect and gratitude that transcended military hierarchy. Welcome back, Agent Stevens. Your country needs you. For the first time in 15 years, Rachel Stevens felt like she was finally home. The week following Admiral Kellerman's acknowledgement of Rachel Stevens' true identity brought seismic changes to Fort Henderson's command structure that rippled outward through military channels with the inexorable force of institutional transformation. The careful balance of secrecy and protocol that had maintained stability for decades suddenly required complete recalibration to accommodate a reality that challenged fundamental assumptions about accountability and truth. Colonel Webb found himself summoned to General Harrison's office Monday morning for what he assumed would be a routine briefing about the memorial service controversy. Instead, he encountered a room full of senior officers whose expressions suggested that his concerns about Rebecca Morgan's behavior had evolved into something far more complex than simple disciplinary action. "Colonel Webb," Harrison began formally, his tone carrying the weight of decisions already made at levels far above Webb's authority, "your investigation into Ms. Morgan's background has revealed information that requires immediate classification at levels exceeding your current clearance. Effective immediately, you're being reassigned to administrative duties pending completion of security review procedures." The announcement hit Webb like a physical blow, destroying his certainty about Rebecca's deception while revealing that his attempts to expose her had somehow triggered his own professional downfall. The injustice of the situation, being punished for attempting to protect base security, consumed his thoughts even as he recognized the futility of protest against decisions that had clearly been made by officials whose authority exceeded his own. "Sir, with respect, my investigation revealed significant discrepancies in the subject's background that warrant serious security review," Webb replied, his voice carrying the desperation of someone watching his career collapse for reasons he couldn't understand. Her behavior during the memorial service demonstrated clear disrespect for military traditions. Harrison studied Webb with something approaching pity, understanding that the colonel's rigid adherence to protocol had blinded him to complexities that required more nuanced thinking than his training had provided. "Colonel, your investigation revealed exactly what it was designed to reveal," Harrison said quietly. "Ms. Morgan's background contains elements that require special handling by personnel with appropriate clearances and historical knowledge. Your reassignment reflects the sensitivity of these matters rather than any failure on your part." Quote, "The explanation was both true and deliberately incomplete, designed to preserve Webb's dignity while removing him from a situation that exceeded his ability to process appropriately. His replacement would be someone with sufficient clearance and operational experience to understand the delicate balance required when dealing with personnel whose existence challenged official narratives." Lieutenant Stevens received notification of her temporary assignment as Webb's replacement with mixed emotions that reflected her growing understanding of the moral complexities surrounding military service. Her documentation of Webb's harassment had contributed to his downfall, but she felt no satisfaction in witnessing the destruction of a career, even one built on the kind of rigid thinking that stifled genuine progress. Rachel spent Monday afternoon in meetings with Pentagon officials who'd arrived at Fort Henderson, with briefcases full of documents requiring her signature and acknowledgement. The papers represented the formal end of Rebecca Morgan's existence, and the careful construction of a new identity that would allow Rachel Stevens to emerge from exile without triggering the kind of public scrutiny that could expose classified operations. "Dr. Rachel Stevens," she read aloud from the credentials that would define her new position, testing the sound of a name she hadn't used professionally for 15 years. "Director of Advanced Tactical Studies, Fort Henderson Military Education Center." The title carried more than just academic authority. It represented recognition of expertise gained through experiences that couldn't be publicly acknowledged while providing the institutional platform necessary to influence future generations of military leaders. Her curriculum would be uniquely positioned to address the ethical complexities that arose when operational necessity conflicted with political expediency. Admiral Kellerman remained at Fort Henderson through Tuesday, overseeing the delicate process of institutional adjustment that Rachel's emergence had necessitated. His presence served multiple purposes, demonstrating high-level support for the changes being implemented, while ensuring that potentially disruptive information remained contained within appropriate channels. The official explanation for Webb's reassignment focused on administrative restructuring rather than performance issues, protecting his record while removing him from contact with classified information that could complicate his future assignments. His replacement, Colonel Maria Santos, arrived Wednesday with extensive special operations background and security clearances that equipped her to handle sensitive personnel matters with appropriate discretion. Janet Collins approached Rachel Thursday afternoon with the nervous energy of someone who'd spent days wrestling with guilt and professional anxiety about her previous behavior. The revelation that Rebecca Morgan had been someone far more significant than a simple contractor forced her to confront the moral implications of her compliance with Webb's harassment campaign. "Dr. Stevens," she began hesitantly, using the title that Fort Henderson personnel had been instructed to employ when addressing their former orientation classmate. "I need to apologize for my behavior during the contractor program. I should have spoken up when Colonel Webb was treating you inappropriately. Rachel studied the younger woman with compassion, recognizing in her the kind of moral awakening that often followed exposure to institutional failures. Janet's apology represented more than personal guilt. It demonstrated the kind of ethical development that Rachel hoped to foster through her new position. You made decisions based on the information available to you and the incentive structures you faced, Rachel replied. That's human nature, not moral failure. The question now is what you'll do differently when similar situations arise in the future. The conversation that followed became Rachel's first informal lesson in the kind of ethical instruction she would soon be providing to military officers. She helped Janet understand that moral courage required practical skills that could be developed through training and practice, rather than representing innate character traits that people either possessed or lacked. Mark Thompson sought out Rachel Friday morning with questions that reflected his growing understanding of the complex realities underlying military service. His 20 years of Navy experience had taught him to recognize expertise when he encountered it. But Rachel's revelations challenged his assumptions about the relationship between official recognition and actual competence. I've been thinking about that tactical exercise, he said without preamble, his tone reflecting genuine professional curiosity rather than skepticism. Your knowledge wasn't theoretical. It was operational. How many missions like that have you actually conducted? Rachel considered her response carefully, understanding that Mark represented the kind of experienced veteran who could benefit from honest discussion about the moral complexities of special operations, while possessing the maturity to handle difficult truths appropriately. More than I care to remember, she replied, some successful, some not, all of them complicated by factors that never appear in after-action reports or training manuals. Their conversation evolved into an extended discussion about the gap between tactical training and ethical reality, the kind of honest professional dialogue that Rachel would soon be facilitating on an institutional level. Mark's questions helped her refine her thinking about curriculum design that would address practical moral challenges rather than theoretical philosophical concepts. General Harrison spent Friday afternoon reviewing preliminary proposals for Rachel's new department, understanding that her position represented more than just an academic appointment. The Advanced Tactical Studies program would serve as a laboratory for developing the kind of ethically grounded military leadership that could prevent future tragedies like Operation Silent Thunder. The curriculum proposals reflected Rachel's unique perspective on military service, combining advanced tactical training with intensive ethical instruction that addressed the moral complexities arising when operational effectiveness conflicted with institutional convenience. Her course descriptions promised to challenge students' assumptions about duty, honor, and the relationship between individual conscience and collective mission. This is revolutionary, Harrison observed as he reviewed her educational philosophy. You're proposing to teach officers that moral courage sometimes requires refusing orders or challenging institutional authority. Rachel nodded, understanding that her approach would generate controversy while potentially preventing the kind of institutional failures that had cost her teammates their lives. The military needs leaders who can think critically about complex situations rather than simply following procedures, she replied. Phoenix team died because people in authority positions prioritized political convenience over operational integrity. Teaching future officers to recognize and resist similar pressures might prevent other teams from facing the same betrayal. Weekend brought the first signs of cultural shift that would eventually transform Fort Henderson's institutional character. Young officers who'd witnessed the memorial service controversy began asking questions about classified operations and the relationship between official recognition and actual service. Conversations that suggested Rachel's influence was already extending beyond formal educational channels. Webb's departure Monday morning was handled with the kind of professional courtesy that preserved his dignity while ensuring he understood the finality of his reassignment. His replacement with Colonel Santos sent clear signals throughout the base that the new leadership prioritized competence and ethical conduct over rigid adherence to traditional authority structures. Rachel used the weekend to design her office space in ways that would facilitate the kind of honest dialogue she hoped to encourage among her students. Rather than the formal academic environment typical of military education facilities, she created a setting that would feel more like a professional consultation than a classroom lecture, encouraging the kind of open discussion that could address morally complex scenarios. The transformation of Fort Henderson had begun with one woman's silent protest, but its continuation would require institutional commitment to the kind of ethical development that challenged comfortable assumptions about military service. Rachel understood that her real work was just beginning, building educational programs that could influence generations of officers while honoring the sacrifice of teammates who would never receive public recognition for their service. 6 months later, Fort Henderson's Advanced Tactical Studies program had evolved into something unprecedented in military education, a hybrid institution that combined rigorous technical training with intensive ethical instruction designed to prepare officers for the moral complexities they would inevitably encounter in operational environments. Dr. Rachel Stevens stood before her first full cohort of students, 24 carefully selected officers representing all branches of the armed services, their faces reflecting mixtures of curiosity, skepticism, and professional ambition. This classroom operates under different rules than most military educational environments, Rachel began, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone whose expertise had been earned through experience rather than academic credentials. We'll be discussing classified operations, moral failures, and institutional betrayals that never appear in official training materials. Everything said in this room remains confidential, but everything learned here must influence how you lead when you return to operational assignments. The students represented the kind of high-potential officers that military leadership hoped would eventually reach senior positions, where their decision-making would affect thousands of lives and billions of dollars in resources. Their selection for Rachel's program marked them as individuals whose intellectual capabilities and moral development warranted special investment. Captain Sarah Chen, no relation to Rachel's fallen teammate but carrying the same family name that triggered painful memories, raised her hand with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to academic excellence. Her record showed graduating first in her class at the Naval Academy, followed by distinguished performance in surface warfare assignments. Dr. Stevens, our preliminary reading included references to Operation Silent Thunder, but the official records are classified beyond our access level. How can we learn from historical examples if we can't study the complete facts? Rachel had anticipated this question, understanding that her curriculum's effectiveness depended on providing detailed case studies of actual operations while respecting classification requirements that protected ongoing national security interests. Captain Chen, you'll find that the most important lessons from operations like Silent Thunder don't require access to tactical details or specific intelligence, she replied. The moral failures that led to that operation's tragic outcome were rooted in decision-making processes and institutional cultures that can be studied and understood without compromising current operations. Quote, she activated the classroom's secure presentation system, displaying a timeline that showed the political and military decisions leading up to Operation Silent Thunder without revealing specific geographic locations or intelligence sources. The sanitized case study revealed how tactical success had been sacrificed for diplomatic convenience, resulting in the abandonment of American operatives when their mission became politically inconvenient. The Phoenix team was deployed with specific objectives that served clear national security interests, Rachel explained, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of discussing her teammates' deaths in clinical academic terms. When political considerations changed, the decision was made to abandon the team rather than risk diplomatic embarrassment. 5 operators died, because institutional leaders prioritize short-term political convenience over long-term strategic integrity. Lieutenant James Morrison, another painfully familiar name that reminded Rachel of her fallen demolitions expert, studied the timeline with the analytical intensity that had earned him recognition as one of the Army's most promising young officers. His questions reflected genuine intellectual engagement with the moral complexities Rachel was presenting. Dr. Stevens, what alternatives existed for the decision-makers involved? If extracting the team would have compromised diplomatic relations with key allies, how should commanders have balanced competing priorities? The question struck at the heart of Rachel's educational philosophy, teaching officers to think critically about complex situations rather than accepting convenient justifications for morally questionable decisions. Lieutenant Morrison, that's exactly the kind of thinking that leads to institutional failures, she replied firmly. The question assumes that diplomatic relations were more important than operator lives, but it doesn't examine whether that assumption was valid or whether other alternatives existed that could have protected both interests. She spent the next hour guiding the class through alternative decision-making frameworks that prioritized human life while achieving strategic objectives, demonstrating how creative thinking and moral courage could generate solutions that traditional military hierarchy often discouraged or ignored. Mark Thompson joined the program as a guest instructor, bringing his perspective as someone who'd witnessed Rachel's transformation from mysterious contractor to respected educator. His sessions focused on the practical challenges of maintaining ethical standards in environments where moral compromise was often presented as operational necessity. The temptation is always to rationalize questionable decisions by focusing on the broader mission, Mark explained to the class during one of his presentations. But ethical leadership requires recognizing that how you achieve objectives is often more important than whether you achieve them, because methods determine whether your success is sustainable or merely temporary. His instruction drew heavily on case studies from his own Navy experience, providing students with practical examples of how moral courage had influenced operational outcomes, while demonstrating that ethical leadership enhanced rather than compromised military effectiveness. Colonel Santos observed several classes during the program's first semester, her presence serving both as administrative oversight and implicit endorsement of Rachel's unconventional approach to military education. Her own special operations background enabled her to appreciate the sophistication of Rachel's curriculum while understanding its potential impact on institutional culture. This program is producing officers who think differently about command responsibility, Santos reported to General Harrison during one of their regular briefings. They're more willing to question orders that seem morally questionable, while demonstrating enhanced tactical competence in complex scenarios. The cultural transformation extended beyond formal classroom instruction into informal discussions that took place throughout Fort Henderson. Officers who'd completed Rachel's program began influencing their peers through conversations that challenged traditional assumptions about military hierarchy and decision-making authority. Rachel established a tradition of Friday afternoon seminars where students could discuss current events and contemporary military challenges using analytical frameworks developed through their historical case studies. These sessions often generated the most valuable learning experiences, as students applied ethical reasoning to situations that weren't yet resolved by official policy or doctrine. Dr. Stevens asked Major David Kim during one such seminar, "How do we maintain unit cohesion when ethical analysis suggests that institutional policies may be morally questionable? Isn't there a tension between critical thinking and military discipline?" The question reflected the kind of sophisticated moral reasoning that Rachel hoped to develop in all her students. The ability to recognize ethical complexities while understanding practical constraints that operating in hierarchical organizations created. Major Kim, military discipline that's based on blind obedience is ultimately self-defeating, she replied. Effective military organizations require leaders who can think critically about complex situations while maintaining unit cohesion through shared commitment to genuine rather than superficial values. Her answer led to extended discussion about the difference between discipline based on fear and discipline based on mutual respect and shared purpose. Students began understanding that effective military leadership required earning subordinates' trust through competence and integrity, rather than demanding obedience through rank and authority alone. Janet Collins enrolled in one of Rachel's continuing education courses, seeking to understand the moral complexities she'd failed to recognize during the contractor orientation program. Her participation demonstrated the kind of personal growth that Rachel's teaching was designed to foster, transforming painful recognition of past failures into commitment to future ethical development. "I've been thinking about my behavior during the orientation program," Janet said during a private conversation with Rachel after one evening class. "I knew Colonel Webb's treatment of you was inappropriate, but I was too concerned about my own career to speak up. How do I ensure I don't make similar compromises in the future?" Rachel appreciated Janet's honest self-assessment while recognizing it as an opportunity to demonstrate practical applications of the ethical reasoning she taught to military officers. The first step is understanding that moral courage is a skill that can be developed through practice rather than an innate character trait, Rachel replied. Start by identifying smaller situations where you can practice speaking up for what's right, building your confidence and competence for when larger challenges arise. Quote, "Their conversation evolved into an ongoing mentoring relationship that exemplified Rachel's belief that ethical development required supportive relationships rather than individual struggle against institutional pressure." Janet's transformation from passive observer to active advocate demonstrated the personal growth that effective moral education could produce. The program's success attracted attention from military education officials throughout the Pentagon, leading to requests for Rachel to develop similar curricula for other military installations. Her influence began extending beyond Fort Henderson as officers who'd completed her program carried her analytical frameworks and ethical commitments to new assignments. General Harrison watched the institutional transformation with satisfaction, mixed with concern about potential resistance from officials who preferred traditional approaches to military education. Rachel's success was generating pressure for broader reforms that could challenge established power structures throughout the military hierarchy. "She's changing how our officers think about leadership and moral responsibility," he observed during a secure conference call with Pentagon officials. The long-term implications could be revolutionary for military culture, but the short-term resistance from traditional leadership could be substantial. The conversation reflected broader institutional tensions between innovation and tradition that Rachel's program had brought into sharp focus. Her success was demonstrating that military effectiveness could be enhanced through ethical development, but implementing similar reforms throughout the military would require sustained commitment from senior leadership. As her first year at Fort Henderson concluded, Rachel reflected on the transformation she'd witnessed in her students and herself. Teaching had provided her with purpose that honored her fallen teammates while contributing to institutional changes that might prevent future tragedies like Operation Silent Thunder. The Advanced Tactical Studies program was becoming more than just an educational experiment. It was evolving into a model for military leadership development that prioritized moral courage alongside tactical competence. Rachel's influence was spreading through informal networks of officers who carried her teaching to assignments throughout the military, creating ripple effects that would ultimately transform institutional culture in ways that couldn't be measured through traditional metrics. 5 years later, Fort Henderson had earned recognition throughout the military education community as the institution that produced officers distinguished not only by their tactical competence, but by their unwavering commitment to ethical leadership under pressure. The Advanced Tactical Studies program had expanded beyond its original scope to include international students, defense contractors, and civilian leaders whose responsibilities required understanding military decision-making processes. Dr. Rachel Stevens stood in her office on a quiet December morning, reviewing applications for the following year's program, while reflecting on the transformation she'd witnessed in military culture since emerging from 15 years of exile. The wall behind her desk displayed a collection of photographs and letters from former students, visual testimonies to the influence her teaching had generated throughout the armed services. General Harrison, now nearing retirement himself, knocked on her open door with the informal courtesy that had characterized their relationship since that evening conversation in the base cemetery years earlier. "Rachel, I wanted to discuss the memorial dedication ceremony scheduled for this afternoon," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd become both colleague and friend. "The families of Phoenix team members have been notified that their loved ones will finally receive appropriate recognition for their service." The memorial had been Rachel's condition for accepting permanent status at Fort Henderson, a quiet monument that would honor her fallen teammates without compromising operational security or exposing classified details about Operation Silent Thunder. The granite marker bore their names alongside an inscription acknowledging their sacrifice in service to operations that couldn't be publicly detailed. "It's taken 20 years, but they're finally getting the recognition they deserved," Rachel replied, her voice carrying satisfaction mixed with lingering sadness about the price that recognition had required. "Their families have lived with convenient fictions for too long." Quote, "The memorial ceremony was intentionally small and private, attended only by family members, close friends, and a select group of military officials who possessed the security clearances necessary to understand the true circumstances of Phoenix Team's final mission. Admiral Kellerman had traveled from Washington to deliver remarks that would acknowledge the team's sacrifice without revealing details that remained classified. Colonel Santos, now serving as Fort Henderson's commanding officer, had overseen the memorial's design and construction, with the attention to detail that reflected her understanding of its symbolic importance. The monument occupied a prominent location near the base's main administrative buildings, ensuring that future generations of officers would encounter it regularly during their time at Fort Henderson. Rachel arrived at the ceremony site 30 minutes early, wanting private time to honor her teammates before the formal proceedings began. She stood before the memorial, reading their names carved into black granite, remembering each face and voice with the clarity that grief had etched permanently into her memory. James Morrison, Sarah Chen, Miguel Santos, David Park, and Anthony Rodriguez, 5 people whose deaths had shaped not only her personal journey, but ultimately influenced institutional changes that would affect thousands of future military personnel. Their sacrifice had meaning now in ways that she couldn't have imagined during the dark years of exile and anonymity. "They would be proud of what you've accomplished," said a voice behind her, and Rachel turned to see Admiral Kellerman approaching with the measured pace of someone who understood the weight of such moments. "I hope so," she replied. "Everything I've done here has been about ensuring their deaths weren't meaningless, that future teams wouldn't face the same betrayal we experienced." Kellerman nodded, his expression reflecting years of accumulated wisdom about the complexities of military service and the importance of moral leadership in preventing institutional failures. The Advanced Tactical Studies program has influenced military culture in ways that extend far beyond Fort Henderson, he observed. "Officers who've completed your program are applying ethical reasoning to complex situations throughout their careers, creating ripple effects that may prevent future tragedies like Operation Silent Thunder." Quote, "The ceremony began promptly at 1,400 hours, with the presentation of colors and playing of the national anthem. Rachel rendered a crisp salute for the first time since returning to military service, her gesture carrying emotional weight that encompassed both personal healing and professional commitment to the institution she'd once felt betrayed by." Admiral Kellerman's remarks focused on the hidden sacrifices made by military personnel whose service couldn't be publicly acknowledged, while emphasizing the importance of institutional accountability in honoring such sacrifices appropriately. "The members of Phoenix team died serving their country in operations that remain classified for legitimate national security reasons," he said, his voice carrying across the small gathering with practiced authority. "But their families and colleagues deserve recognition that their sacrifice was meaningful, and that lessons learned from their service continue influencing military operations today." Family members placed flowers at the memorial's base, while former colleagues shared quiet conversations about memories that couldn't be discussed in public forums, but provided comfort to those who'd lost loved ones in circumstances that official records couldn't accurately describe. Rachel spoke briefly about her teammates' professionalism and dedication, avoiding operational details while conveying the personal characteristics that had made them effective operators and valued friends. Her remarks emphasized their commitment to protecting others rather than seeking personal recognition, traits that exemplified the kind of service-oriented leadership her program sought to develop in future officers. Mark Thompson attended the ceremony in his capacity as a civilian defense contractor, his presence representing the ongoing connection between Rachel's current educational mission and the practical applications of military training in complex operational environments. His continuing collaboration with the Advanced Tactical Studies program ensured that curriculum development remained grounded in real-world challenges rather than theoretical concepts. Lieutenant Colonel Stevens, formerly Lieutenant Stevens, participated in the ceremony as one of Rachel's most successful former students, her career trajectory demonstrating the practical benefits of ethical leadership development. Her current assignment involved training other officers in advanced tactical procedures while maintaining the commitment to moral reasoning that Rachel's program had instilled. "Dr. Stevens' teaching changed how I think about command responsibility," Stevens explained to visiting Pentagon officials who'd attended the ceremony to evaluate the program's continued effectiveness. "Officers who complete this program understand that technical competence must be balanced with ethical reasoning if military operations are to serve legitimate national interests." As the ceremony concluded and attendees dispersed, Rachel remained at the memorial with Admiral Kellerman and General Harrison, three military professionals whose careers had been shaped by Operation Silent Thunder's tragic outcome and the institutional changes that had followed. "What's next for the program?" Harrison asked. Understanding that Rachel's influence had grown beyond Fort Henderson to encompass military education policy at the highest levels. Expansion to other installations, development of distance learning capabilities for officers who can't attend residential programs, and continued refinement of curriculum that addresses emerging challenges in military ethics, Rachel replied. "The program's success has created demand that exceeds our current capacity." Kellerman nodded approvingly, recognizing that Rachel's educational innovations represented the kind of institutional transformation that could prevent future moral failures, while enhancing military effectiveness through improved leadership development. The National Defense Authorization Act will include funding for similar programs at 5 additional installations, he informed them. "Your model is becoming the standard for advanced military education." As evening approached, Rachel walked alone through Fort Henderson's grounds, observing the cultural transformation that had occurred since her arrival as a mysterious civilian contractor 5 years earlier. Young officers moved with confidence tempered by ethical awareness, their conversations reflecting the kind of critical thinking about military service that her program had helped develop. The base chapel, where she'd once sought solitude during her period of exile, now hosted regular ethics seminars for officers who wanted to explore moral complexities beyond what formal curriculum requirements provided. These voluntary sessions attracted participants from throughout the region, creating informal networks of ethically committed military leaders. Rachel's apartment had been replaced by quarters befitting her status as a senior civilian educator, but she'd maintained the same practical minimalism that had characterized her living space during the contractor orientation program. The only addition was a photograph of Phoenix team taken during their final training exercise, 5 faces frozen in time as reminders of the price that institutional failures could exact from dedicated personnel. Her evening routine included reading applications for the following year's Advanced Tactical Studies program, evaluating candidates whose potential for ethical leadership development would determine the program's continued influence on military culture. Each application represented an opportunity to influence future military decisions through education that combined tactical competence with moral reasoning. A knock on her door interrupted her review process, and she opened it to find Colonel Webb standing in the hallway with the hesitant bearing of someone seeking reconciliation for past conflicts. His reassignment had led to productive service in administrative positions that utilized his organizational skills while removing him from direct personnel management responsibilities. "Dr. Stevens," he began formally, "I wanted to apologize for my behavior during the contractor orientation program. I've spent considerable time reflecting on my actions and their underlying motivations." Rachel studied him carefully, recognizing genuine remorse in his expression while appreciating the personal growth that such acknowledgement represented. "Colonel Webb, we all make decisions based on the information available to us and the institutional pressures we face," she replied, echoing words she'd spoken to Janet Collins years earlier. "What matters now is how you apply lessons learned from that experience to future challenges." Their conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering topics ranging from institutional leadership to personal accountability in complex organizational environments. Webb's questions reflected genuine intellectual engagement with moral reasoning rather than defensive justification of past behavior. As he prepared to leave, Webb paused at her door with an observation that demonstrated the kind of institutional wisdom that Rachel's program sought to develop in all military personnel. "The Advanced Tactical Studies program is changing military culture in ways that extend far beyond tactical competence," he said thoughtfully. "Officers are learning to think critically about complex situations while maintaining commitment to legitimate military objectives. It's the kind of education I wish had been available earlier in my career." Rachel watched him walk away, understanding that his transformation represented the broader institutional changes that ethical education could produce when implemented with sustained commitment and appropriate resources. The following morning brought news that one of her former students, now serving as a battalion commander in Afghanistan, had prevented a potential civilian casualty incident by applying ethical reasoning frameworks learned during his Fort Henderson training. His decision to question orders that seemed tactically sound but morally questionable had avoided international diplomatic complications while protecting innocent lives. Such reports had become increasingly common as Rachel's former students advanced to positions of greater responsibility throughout the military hierarchy. Their influence was creating cultural changes that prioritized ethical reasoning alongside tactical effectiveness, generating institutional transformation that honored Phoenix team's sacrifice through practical applications of moral courage. Rachel Stevens had spent 15 years in exile from an institution that had betrayed her trust and cost her teammates their lives. But her return as an educator had enabled her to influence military culture in ways that could prevent future tragedies while ensuring that fallen comrades received the recognition their sacrifice deserved. The Advanced Tactical Studies program had become her legacy, an educational institution that would continue developing ethical military leaders long after her own retirement. Phoenix team's sacrifice had meaning now through the moral courage of officers who carried their lessons forward into an uncertain future, where the need for ethical leadership remained as critical as tactical competence. Standing before their memorial in the gathering dusk, Rachel Stevens felt the peace that comes from transforming personal tragedy into institutional change that serves others. Her teammates' voices no longer called out from forgotten graves. They lived on through the ethical commitment of military leaders who understood that genuine service required moral courage alongside technical competence. The silent service had found its voice. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.